Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Clinical Supervisor Emotional Competence Skill Building Program. I'm Dr. Madeleine Muller, and in this first exercise, we are still focusing on emotional insight, which provides your foundation for emotional competence, and that's simply being able to understand how specifically emotion is going to affect behavior. And we're going to particularly look at something that Shahjar Tamim calls the saboteurs in this exercise. So just to remind us, when we go through our daily lives, we constantly meet all kinds of stimuli that may lead to a specific or strong emotion. And these emotions can lead to these unconscious automatic behaviors that Shahzad calls saboteurs. So to give an example, maybe you have a registrar that tends to be quite late in the mornings. You've spoken to him before. It's not made much of a difference. And then one morning they're showing up a couple of hours late again. And you might also be quite tired or frustrated. It's a very busy clinic. And suddenly this emotion arises, and it can either be the negative emotions can either be fear or distress, but in this case you find yourself going into a rage, which is the biological impulse to destroy an obstacle in your way. And we don't like having unpleasant emotions, and our bodies make us, our fight, flight, freeze system makes us want to do something. So there's a particular behavior, which Shahzad calls saboteur, because it tends to make things worse, that then arises. And so you might find yourself shouting at your registrar or criticizing or making a long lecture or even a sarcastic comment. And you can be sure that whenever you are behaving in a way that you might feel slightly embarrassed about afterwards, or your registrar is behaving in a way that might not be appropriate, that one of these saboteurs has come into play. So Sajat has very nicely divided them he's actually grouped them into 10. I've arranged them slightly differently into groups of, into sort of 9 different saboteurs. And you'll see there's a nice QR code on the right there. If you haven't yet done the saboteur self-assessment, please scan it. It's a simple online survey. It literally takes about 5 to 7 minutes, and where you'll be able to help identify your favorite mechanisms that you use when you are having a strong emotion. And let's just quickly go through them. So there are fight mechanisms. So some people like to fight and engage when they're feeling anxious or fearful or angry. And the classic one that we all use is the judge, where we criticize and feel ourselves slightly superior and like to point out all the problems either with other people, but we can also turn it on ourselves. Some people even go on to a hyperachiever kind of a thing, where they constantly trying to outshine everybody else around them as a way to cope with their negative feelings. Hyper-rational, very common for us profs or lecturers or people who like to like the scientific rational side of things. And when we get anxious, that's when you go into over-analyzing somebody else, preaching, lecturing, the classic mansplaining. Controller, again, if you're somebody who's very organized, those Excel sheet mothers, might find yourself when you're anxious that you start manipulating everybody else around you, or you might gaslight somebody else in terms of making them, trying to convince them what you think they're thinking. And outright bullying is a form of being a controller. Some people do not like getting into conflict and do not like fighting, and finds other ways, sort of freeze fawn mechanisms, to reduce anxiety. So some people who are very kind and might end up becoming a pleaser in those scenarios. And what they do is they actually sacrifice their own comfort and their own voice in the hope that that will make things better. Some people become obsessive about their environments or about their work. So your perfectionist, your obsessive compulsive behaviors is actually all mechanisms of dealing with anxiety. And I think hypervigilance is something we all do. That's that lying in the middle of the night and worrying or concerned about all kinds of things that you can't actually do anything about. And the third set of mechanisms are these flight mechanisms, where we either just not showing up for the thing that we're supposed to be dealing with, or avoiding talking about a topic that needs to be sorted out. Victim is another way of not fleeing a situation, not managing what's happening, but feeling very, very sorry for yourself. And then distractor is also a common mechanism we all use. Of course, there are some times when you can't deal with something and it's best just to take a break. But if you are using substances instead of dealing with important issues, and that can include your social media as well as all your addictive substances, then that in itself can also become a saboteur. So the saboteur self-assessment, we all use some of these or all of these at certain times. We all have favorites in particular situations. but there are particular ones that might arise more than others. So the exercise we're going to do is going to be based on that self-reflection. So if you haven't done it yet, please scan the code, and there'll be an exercise sheet that you can fill in. And if you're able to discuss it with somebody else, that's great. But what I want you to do is think of a scenario where you were giving advice to a junior colleague and that interaction did not go well. So it can be any scenario where you were speaking to a colleague, but preferably somebody that had less power than you. And we're going to use the Saboteur survey to actually self-reflect on what happened. If you are struggling, because you're a pleaser, to not have had any recent events where you feel that you did not get on with somebody at work, you can also use a personal scenario at home. So whether it is with a teenage child or with a parent or with a partner, lots of practice ground at home for saboteurs to arise. So just think of an interaction which did not go well. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to sit down quietly, relax, get into that balcony view, and you're just going to think about that, you and that person who was in that interaction, and you're going to just ask yourself this question, and usually it's quite obvious. Was this junior colleague, this person that I was speaking to, in survival mode? And an additional question could be, what was making them feel unsafe? Or you can reflect, and then after that, you reflect back on yourself. And did I go into survival mode as a result? And again, what was making you feel unsafe? So if we can use the example of the registrar that was late, for example, they might have already been defensive in that conversation, and being able to identify if they were in survival mode, and being able to identify, okay, I was in survival mode as a response to that. The next thing is actually to name and notice the emotion. And first, again, think about your colleague and think which main emotion were they in. Quite often it can be a mixture of distress, fear, or rage, but usually there's one that's predominant. Were they very upset? A lot of tears is usually a good example of that. Were they very anxious, or were they very angry in that scenario? And again, then you reflect back on yourself and think, well, what was the baseline emotion that was predominant for you? And the third step of this exercise, you're now going to actually link that to a specific behavior, and you're going to use your saboteur assessment. There's a nice little summary that I will include as well of all the different saboteurs, and try and identify one or more of the actual counterproductive behaviors that this colleague was displaying at that time. And then again, similarly, then reflecting back and look at what behavior that triggered from yourself. So for example, if you were criticizing, then that was your judge saboteur that was coming up in that scenario. And then lastly, and this is where I think it gets interesting, is then to look at, well, what was the outcome of that, of those behaviors? So let's say the registrar backchatted you and criticized you in return for whatever. How did that make you feel, and what was the result of them behaving in that way? And then again, looking at your own behavior. So if you shouted at the registrar or if you criticized the registrar, to look at how that impacted then on them as an event. It's a very simple exercise. It actually takes quite quickly, and it's something you want to do after everything has happened and you've got a bit of quiet time to reflect. And it's very helpful to come from a place of compassion when we are looking at these kinds of events, just sort of being able to understand, oh dear, the survival self of myself was out of the box, and to see the implications of what happens when we go into these saboteur modes. So once one's done this exercise, it's a kind of exercise you can do every now and then when you've had a difficult interaction. And what starts happening is you start being able to apply this when you are actually within the interaction at the time. So suddenly a conversation is not going well, and you suddenly notice, oh, hold on, that's a saboteur that's just come out of the cupboard. Thank you.